Hey, this is Bishop Jackson on Affinity Xtra, welcoming you to the second part of our show in 2021. It's the first time I'm talking to you, so God bless you. Thank you so much for sticking with us on Affinity Xtra, where we do extraordinary stuff. Please remember, link us. If you see us with a bit of clip on YouTube, can you like, subscribe, and share it with your friends, please? Yeah? And then also, when you get us on Spotify, you can share that as well. And you can just drop the app on, listen to that for the whole day. And remember, just send us your comments. Let us know what you're thinking. Let us know what you're doing. So, as you know, I've been talking about Dr. King. Previous to this, I spoke about Marcus Garvey, spoke about Sam Sharp. But this time we're looking at Dr. King. We love to talk about Dr. King. One of the wonderful things he talks about is the blueprint for life, the blueprint for life. And that's a great sermon that he talks about, how to navigate your way. Do you have a plan? And this is what he talked about with young people. And Dr. King also especially allows us to see determination to get through not only a day of crisis, but to get to a better day of being successful. He also reflected upon the fact of the changes of his day. When he was moving through, it was not popular to be non-violent, because right behind him, he trained, listen to this, listen carefully. He trained John Lewis, but he also trained Stokely Carmichael. Black Power crew was sat right behind him. Stokely Carmichael learned his leadership skills under Dr. King. He was always moving around with Dr. King. So the fire was always behind him when he's trying to speak about this non-violent resistance as an action, as an active action. Well, Stokely Carmichael couldn't see it. And as soon as they assassinated Dr. King, Stokely Carmichael just went and he had to talk about black power. He had to talk about power that we are not going to beg for, that we are going to take for ourselves. And so behind Dr. King's seeds, there are powerful personalities, powerful people behind him. So if you think that he did not pass on the leadership, he passed it on, but we don't see the transformative actions as we should. We should also see Dr. Jesse Jackson. Jesse Jackson is a formidable political figure in our world around us. So we should not forget that there is a legacy. John Lewis passed away recently and he made changes in government. And so we need to recognize this. You know, Dr. King talked about staying awake through a great, remaining awake through a great revolution. That's from his book. Let me just check what this book is. It is A Knock at Midnight, and this is the great sermons of Dr. Martin Luther King. And I bought this so long ago that I marked it up and I marked it up. And when he talks about this staying awake through a great revolution, he then speaks about Rip Van Winkle that goes to sleep, then wakes up and realizes that he's in a new day. And so Dr. King was saying to us, do not go to sleep in the day of the revolution. And today I'm saying to you, we cannot sleep upon our children's future and the present circumstance that we are in. And so what's happening around us? We are being distracted from the present circumstance that we are in. COVID is raging on our streets. There is heresy running around, and there is destruction at our gateway as a community. And we need to challenge ourselves to stay awake amongst this great revolution that's happening. You know, we have to call our governments to book. And Dr. King was always willing to call the government to pay what they are supposed to pay. He's saying, sometimes he would say it's like a check given to them. It's like a check given to them, and all they're saying is they want to cash the check in of rights and civil rights. And he talks about God making all things new. And says, he talks about this. First, I'll read a little bit from an excerpt from this sermon. And he says, now, whenever anything new comes into history, it brings with it new challenges and new opportunities. And I would like to deal with the challenges that we face today as a result of this triple revolution that is taking place in our world today. And he said, first, we are challenged to develop a world perspective, No individual can live alone. No nation can live alone. And anyone who feels that they can live alone is sleeping through a revolution. Come on, who is he talking about? He preached that so far back that you ask yourself the question, why are each country, or why are we in our post-Brexit existence in a crisis? Because we thought that we would be great by ourselves. And that's what our government thought, and that's what the majority of the voters in this country thought. You know, Dr. King shows us that the world is a brotherhood. It's a global village, and we need each other. He said this, now it is true that geographical oneness of this age has come into being through a large extent of modern man's scientific ingenuity. Modern man, through his scientific genius, has made us able to dwarf distances in place and time through technology. Our jet planes have compressed into minutes distances that once took weeks and even months. All this is to tell us that the world is a neighborhood. I love how Dr. King says this. The next thing he says is this: through scientific and technological genius, we have made this world a neighborhood, and yet we have not had the ethical commitment to make of it a brotherhood. So he said that the neighborhood's there, we are connected to each other, but there is no brotherhood. We must learn, this is what he says, listen, we must learn to live together as brothers, or we will perish together as fools. We are tied together in a single garment of destiny, caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. And whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. For some strange reason, I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be. What a message for today. What a message for our community. You know, when we get into the underbelly of Dr. King, we see a man who, as Cornel West said, he was wed to the poor. What does that mean? So connected that he had this passion, this love that would not die to the least of these. And this was Jesus as well. Every time Jesus spoke, he emphasized on, not every time, but majority of time. You could see the majority of time, even in Jesus's mandate sermon that he goes into the temple to preach after coming from the wilderness, he mentions the poor. The Spirit of the Lord God is upon me because he hath anointed me. And so when you hear Jesus speak about the poor, and he talks about the poor needing to be delivered, those who are, one, poor in spirit, he talks about in the Beatitudes. Why is Jesus emphasizing this? Because there are two versions of poverty. And Dr. King knew this. He knew that there was a physical version of poverty that we need to make sure that we are leaning towards and showing favor. You know, all the way across the Bible, and perhaps this is why Israel's getting hammered right now, is because so many times God says to Israel, you have a covenant to care for the poor. And I wonder how rich is Israel and how poor are the countries around them. You know, I love the idea of God coming back and reforming and renewing his covenant with Israel and putting his foot on the Mount of Olives. But I am not in love with their practices in the modern times of prejudicing African Jews and making them live in ghettoism when they gave them a home, when they were being punished or brutalized or being oppressed or trying to be exterminated by the Germans and some other Eastern European groups. Sometimes I challenge myself to ask them the ethical question. You know, that when a bomb is dropped from Israel to Palestine and some child dies, is this justice or is this something that somebody is guilty for? I think that we have to look at the ethical questions. I think Dr. King always looked at the ethical questions. I love it how he gets us to think. He gets us to think about the least of these around the world, this global challenge that we have in our African community to say, yes, we've got issues in the West. Yes, Yes, they stormed Capitol Hill, but the bigger question is, what are we doing in our motherland? How are we sending? How are we guiding? How are we helping? How are we building up the place where God has called us to come from, or God has called us to look back upon? It is nothing for everybody to talk about the Apostle Paul saying, yes, by every means necessary, we must save the Jewish people. But it is something for us all the time. We are being critically analyzed when we talk about, hey, how are we going to empower our African diaspora? How are we going to now feed back into the Caribbean and feed back into the motherland? You know, Dr. Martin Luther King had to come to a point where he understood what Black Power meant. And so James Cone talks about his understanding now of Black Power. And when we talk about Black Power is the challenge to look at how to empower African people to be who they're supposed to be in the earth. And that's what Marcus Garvey pointed us towards. And I think that the figure of Dr. Martin Luther King is more than just one speech. He is the sermonizing preacher. He is a Nobel Prize winner, and he is a champion for the poor. And so you and I need to look at this legacy. You know that when Michael Eric Dyson looked at Dr. King, he examined his life like this. He says, Martin Luther King's death, how it changed America. And he looks at a book that examines Dr. King in the light of him always having to reflect upon death on his doorstep. And so in his book, April the 4th, 1968, he talks about how Dr. King faced death. How Dr. King had to face death in every moment how he existed. J. Edgar Hoover, he was aiming to destroy King's career. It says this, I'll read an excerpt from his book. It says, white Americans must also demand the truth about how the elements of our government, especially the FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover, tried to destroy King's career, marriage, and ultimately his life. Hoover was obsessed with King, using illegal and immoral methods to tarnish the leadership by claiming that he was a communist and by alleging financial misdemeanors and snooping on King's sex life and withholding information about King's death threats. King's financial integrity was above reproach. Hoover's attempt to paint him as a greedy minister were unsuccessful. Hoover's pursuit of King, his wicked pursuit of King, also failed to prove that he was a communist. Though his advisors Stanley Livingston and Jack Odell were to varying degrees in connection with the Communist Party and the leftist organization. So that's what Michael Eric Dyson talks about. What he was talking about here was that King was so powerful. And you think about King being so powerful. He did not have an army. He did not have a militia behind him like some other orange people that we don't want to talk about. He did not call that militia to go and kill anybody. He told them to stand up for justice, and they were brutalized. But he was still the most feared character of his era. More than anybody else, he was feared. Why? Because they knew that he had the wind of God behind him. That is what they couldn't cope with, because he was willing to make a sacrifice for those who were less fortunate than himself, for poor people, for black people, for Asian people. When he stood up against the Vietnam War, he stood up against tyranny. And so when we talk about Dr. King, we look at him as a character that is filled with sacrifice. So what is the lesson for us from Dr. King as I conclude this second part of my thoughts on Dr. King? My thoughts are this: I will never deify King. But if we are going to deify any saints on the earth, he deserves sainthood. Why? Because he demonstrated sacrifice with his life. I don't know about the rest. I don't know what they did. I wasn't there. But it is well documented that Dr. King stood himself in harm's way for the least of these. When he went and got that big, powerful rifle, took off his head, what do you think he was doing there? Do you think he was going to get his Nobel Prize? Do you think he was going to get a government issued prize? No. He was going to help sanitary workers get a livable wage. A livable wage. You see? So when I talk about this Dr. King, I talk about him in this sense. I love the way how he made a sacrifice. Listen what he says in the final part of his drum major thing. Let me just wrap this up real quick. He says, if I can help somebody as I pass along, if I can cheer somebody with a word of a song, if I can show somebody who is traveling wrong, then my living will not be in vain. If I can do my duty as a Christian, if I can bring salvation to a world of sin, if I can spread the message as the Master taught, then my living will not be in vain. Yes, Jesus, I want to be on your right or your left-hand side, but not for selfish reason. I want to be on your right or your left-hand side, not in terms of political kingdom or ambition, but I just want to be there in love and justice and in truth and in commitment to others so that we can make of this old world a new world. God bless you. This is Bishop Jackson on Affinity Xtra, where we do extraordinary things. A moment of silence for our great Dr. Martin Luther King.